Hi, welcome to the Three Times podcast. Today I'm talking to Kate Lynch, Director of Highlights Rural Touring Scheme. If you've been to a gig, play or creative event in your local community hall, chances are that it was made possible by Highlights. Highlights is a charity that supports events in rural venues by connecting local people with musicians, actors and artists, and removing much of the financial risk that comes with booking a performer. It is also very active in supporting creative events in schools. Kate describes the challenges faced by venues and performers in putting on gigs in rural areas and how Highlights works to overcome them. So Kate Lynch, thank you for talking to the Three Times podcast. Can I ask you to explain to me what are the processes involved in putting on a gig in a community venue?
Gosh, that's a really good question, and it's with Highlights. It's quite a long process. It starts with Highlights, curating a menu of possibilities, a menu of artists that community venues can then select from. So often that starts with me going out and seeing work and finding artists that I think would work well in rural communities and in small spaces like village halls or community centres. And then the venues select the work they feel would fit best in their venue, but also that will be appreciated the most by their communities. Once they've selected that work, there's a bit of a process for me to work out how to squeeze 10 choices out of 4 dates. But eventually we reach a point where every venue should have 1 or 2 shows that they then host in their hall. Then I think the more practical point of view, it's about opening up a space for an artist and an audience. It's about selling tickets, and Highlights does a lot with our venues to help with that. So we sell tickets through our website, so we have online ticketing for all the venues. We do social media, we have a mailing list, we send out a brochure. But in terms of the communities themselves, we don't know them in the same way as the venue hosts do. So they go out locally, they do that hyper-local marketing, they take posters out, they talk to people, they put tickets in shops to be sold by shopkeepers. They'll do all that very, very specific marketing on a kind of one-to-one basis. Often it's to friends and family. I'm a promoter in Kirkby Stephen where I live. So I have a venue there that I host Highlights events in. And quite often it's just when I'm walking around the co-op and someone says, "Oh, you've got me down for 2 tickets, haven't you?" And I say, "No." "Oh, well, you should." Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll do that. So there's quite a lot of being that presence for the performance. And then on the day itself and the lead up to the day, it's about liaising with the artists. So it's about finding out what time the artists will arrive. We often ask that our venues provide a meal. So sometimes it's about asking, well, what dietary requirements there are, getting someone locally to make you a quick stew or a soup that you can serve before a show. And then looking at any tech requirements. All of our artists should be technically self-sufficient. So in terms of the venue, it should be a case of opening the doors and putting some chairs out. But it is about thinking about what your audiences might want as well. So a lot of our venues, they like to sit their audiences cabaret style. They might put tea lights on the table, or they might have snacks on the table. Some of them, if they have theatre style seating, they'll put a chocolate on each seat. And about welcoming people in. We have quite a lot of venues that use bunting, and it's amazing what bunting will do to just warm up a village hall. So it is just about opening that space, welcoming artists, welcoming audiences, and ensuring everyone has the best possible evening.
So if it wasn't for Highlights North, what would be the challenges that artists and venues would face?
I think really Highlights provides that link between the venue and the artist. So at the very basic level, we have access to artists that venue promoters might not. So they have a selection. I curate a menu of around 20 to 25 different artists and companies who are available for the venue to book every season. Without that, I think they would find it much harder to access that number of people. We do have venues who programme work on their own without highlights, and that's absolutely fine. It's to be encouraged. The more that goes on, I think the better. But I think we provide that shortcut. I think the other thing that we provide is the marketing support. But I think most importantly, and somewhat more crassly, we take away any financial risk for the venue. So we're Arts Council funded, we're local authority funded by all three authorities that we sit within. So we can ensure that any venue can programme our work with minimal financial risk to the venue itself. It's not a fundraiser, but in terms of the ticket income, they're unlikely to lose any money by hosting an event. And often we're paying fees which are considerably higher than the ticket income that a small venue can get in.
So how would an artist get on your list of potential performers?
So there's a bit of a mixed response to that, I think. Often they're artists that I'm aware of. I like, if possible, to have seen them. So it might be that I've been to festivals or I've been to performances at other venues. I keep an eye on what other rural touring schemes are doing. So we're one of around 28 rural touring schemes across the country. So I keep an eye on what's going on elsewhere, and scheme managers such as myself talk to each other and we will recommend things that worked well. There are some artists who have been rural touring for a long time and they understand what the need is, and they understand when they turn up at a venue what they're going to get and what to expect, and how to work with the venues, because the venues are being run by volunteers. There is a certain style of working that I think is essential. You have to realise that you're working with people who are giving up time because they're enthusiastic. You're not going to walk into a space with a technician or with a box office manager. You're going to walk in with someone who might have a full-time job, who might have kids at home, who might have been babysitting their grandchildren all day, and they're giving up that time. So there has to be an understanding of that from an artist's point of view. We're also committed to working with regional artists, so we have quite a high target of regional artists that we want to work with each year. So I'm always looking at what's going on locally and sort of keeping an eye on, certainly where we are, keeping an eye on Newcastle or Leeds or Manchester, and seeing who's out there, who's emerging, who might have been around for a while but we haven't quite managed to hook into. So I think that's really key. We have a lot of artists who approach us directly. We try and get back to all of them. It's quite tricky. We're a small team, but generally, we're working with around 45 to 50 artists a year. So it's trying to find that balance between regional artists, national artists, and also international artists, because we do work with international artists as well. Yeah,
it's correct that you work with theatre productions as well as musicians. But thinking specifically about musicians. Mm-hmm. Is there a style of music that you're looking for, or are there several genres, I should say, that you'd be looking for, and some that you think would not work well in the settings that you're talking about?
I think generally I'm up for trying most things. I think the natural slant tends to be into the sort of folk, rootsy Americana genre, because I think often they're used to playing in small venues. Those kind of intimate audience experiences feel very familiar to the artists. So I think that tends to be where we end up sliding. I think there's definitely an appetite for more than that. We've started looking at a little bit more classical music, but I'm not sure the demand is there enough to up that incredibly, but I think to have a flavour of it is good. We've done bits of jazz over the past. Again, it has more of a mixed response, but depending on the venue. I think what's true to say is we have 65 venues across the three areas. They're all different and they all have very, very different audiences. So what will work in one venue very much won't work in a venue 5 miles down the road. So I think it is making sure that when I'm looking for music, that I'm looking for the broadest possible appeal. And also that the audiences often aren't booking because of the performance. I would say 50% of them are booking because they desperately want to see that performer, but the other 50% want to go to something in their village hall, want a shared experience with their neighbours and their friends. And so it's a slightly, you need things to be accessible. You don't want to be going down too much of a niche angle with anything. So trying to keep that kind of broad church of possibilities is really important for me.
Yeah. I've been struck by the kind of audience that attends these gigs. Now, since I've been doing this podcast, I've been going to a lot more local gigs than I used to. I used to travel into Newcastle to see bands, but I've been going to the kind of gigs that you're talking about. And the audience tends to be mature, should we say. Now, I'm not a young man, and I don't feel at all out of place in some of the village halls that the gigs are on at. So I'm wondering if there's a risk, from what you say, that you're kind of strengthening the status quo, and there's for upcoming younger musicians in particular, it might be a bit of a challenge to break into that.
Oh, that's a really good comment. I think there is definitely a question about where the new audiences are coming from, and I think that's something that I think a lot about. We live in a very different world now than even when I started this job 5 years ago. And in some ways I don't think that has anything to do with the pandemic, but has more to do with the digital world and the choice we have at our fingertips from the comfort of our own homes. So I think there is a definite conversation to be had about where those new audiences are. I think there is a reality with village hall venues that for the majority of younger people, going to see a show in your village hall is not the sexiest of options of an evening. Alongside our performance programme, we do an awful lot of work in schools, primary schools and secondary schools, and we're trying to develop that audience for the future. They are the people who are, we hope, going to experience live theatre wherever they are. But equally bearing in mind the more mature audience, I count myself sort of amongst that, in that my children have just gone to secondary school. I'm just at a point where my evenings are becoming my own again. I can suddenly see the possibility of going out again, whereas for the past sort of 13, 14 years that's been tricky. So I think there is that kind of natural shift in people's lives. I think what I try not to do with the work that we programme and the music that we programme is not programme just one thing, to make sure that we're programming, as I said before, a really broad menu, but we're also thinking about who are the new artists, who are doing things differently. Just because an audience is more mature or just because an audience come from a rural community doesn't mean that they're not an educated audience who want something a bit challenging. I think it's just finding the right content, so to speak. For autumn this year, autumn 2024, on the menu, and I've just had all the submissions back today from all of our venues, but on the menu we've got Ruth Lyon and Conrad Bird from Holy Moly and the Crackers in their new duo. We wouldn't have been able to get Holy Moly and the Crackers in one of our village halls, but they're going out as a duo. That's a really exciting proposition. We also have young folk artist Maddie Morris, who actually performed with us in spring 2022, and they're coming back in the autumn, and they're doing amazing work using classical folk to discuss really contemporary issues. So I think, yes, the audiences are more mature. I think generally they always have been for rural venues, but also I think that's mirrored in most arts venues across the country. I don't think that's unusual. No. And also a lot of our villages have an ageing population in them. We're lucky enough to work in some of the most beautiful rural communities across the northwest and the northeast, and a lot of them are mostly populated by people who are older.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the exciting things about what you do is that shows people the importance of live music. I don't know if you saw Doctor Who this weekend, did you?
I didn't, I'm afraid.
Doctor Who fan?
My son was, but he's not quite so obsessed as he was.
Well, we're big Doctor Who fans in our house. The episode this weekend, the main thing, it was like social media taken to the extreme. So the main character lived in a world called Fine World, in which their consciousness was almost entirely in social media. So there was a globe around their head, a virtual globe around their head, in which they communicated with their friends on social media, to the extent that they never saw the outside world at all. And if they wanted to go somewhere, then the device which transmitted their social media to them told them where to go. You know, that's a critique of social media taken to the extreme. But it struck me while I was watching it that there are a growing number of people. I don't think it's young people. I think it's not older people, but it's like middle-aged people and young people. They're growing up in this digital age that you referred to, and they're not realising that there is something different to be had from live music. That it's not the same as having it on Spotify. The experience is different. It's not just the intellectual or emotional enjoyment of the music, it's the being in company and feeling the presence of the music in the venue, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that rings true when you think of the number of artists now who are asking people to put their phones away before the shows start, because they don't want that that vision of everyone watching a live performance through a video screen. I think it is it's really key. And I think I listened to something on the radio recently on Radio 4, which was about a series about teenage boys, and one of the comments on that was that teenage boys now would prefer to socialise in their own bedrooms through their Xboxes or PlayStations than actually sit in a room together and do that, because they can't play the same game if they're actually in the same physical space. And I think that's a little bit like you're talking about, that we are learning how to engage with culture differently. And I think in some ways with live performance, whether that's music or theatre or storytelling or dance, we've got to work out how we compete with that and what we offer and what our messaging is. And I think that that's what we try and do through the work we do with our Participate programme, is try and get as many children and young people as possible to experience live performance. Hopefully, what we really like to do is we like to put a performance on in a village hall and get the school to come to that. So the children and young people are actually seeing their village hall in a different light and kind of seeing what's out there for them. We all know that they want that sort of, often you can get someone's head to be turned by that big ticket, that, the Taylor Swift concert or, those sorts of major stars. So actually there is a place for live performance, but convincing them that that's going to be found on their doorstep is difficult. Yeah.
So I'm an upcoming folk artist, should we say. What would you want from me if I was to approach you and say, please put me on your roster? What kind of stuff would you want?
So the first thing I would do is have a conversation with you, look at some video clips, see if I can come and see you perform. That's really, that is really important. It's really good if we can go and see people perform live, get a real understanding of how they work with the audience. As I said before, rural touring it isn't just about the performer, it is about the experience of being in a venue which is the heart of a community. So I think understanding that an artist can respond to that is really important. So I think, if possible, give me a list of dates you've got coming up, preferably somewhere not too far away from the north. And then also we ask for just all the details. We have what I tend to describe as a rather tiresome company information form, which is essentially a form that just gives us all the information we need to know to then pass it on to our venues so they know whether it's possible to book that particular artist. So, really key things. We're working with very, very small venues. Some of them are great, some of them are big multi-purpose venues, but often some of them are converted churches or converted schools. So actually what's the minimum staging space? How much room do you need? Because for some of our venues that will count an awful lot of artists out. Do you want a stage? Will you play on the floor? How much time do you need to get in? How much time do you need to get out? One of the big things for our venues is they're being used for lots of other things. So often if an artist say, well, we need a 6-hour get-in, our venues can't manage that. They've got a birthday party at 10 and a yoga class at 2. It just doesn't work in terms of their scheduling. So just kind of all that information that could make it easier for a venue to know whether it's possible for them. And then all the kind of marketing materials, any videos, any images, anything that's exciting that you can share with us. More and more Instagram content. It's massively helpful for us in terms of how we sell tickets now. We've had quite a few artists in this last season who've been doing little videos for us for each venue that have gone live on our social media, and those sorts of things are just getting more and more important.
Yeah. So, are you interested in numbers of followers? That seems to be a key thing for some venues.
I don't think we're quite at that stage yet. I think, again, as I say, for us, it's the performer is only part of the package with rural touring. I think sometimes it's about how it fits, about how it feels. We know that regional performers do really well, so we've just had a whole range of performances from Katie Doherty, and she's at Blanchland Abbey, which is a new venue for us. That's on the 15th of June. So regional performers always go down really, really well. We also had Gareth Davis-Jones earlier this season. But then we've also had some real, stalwarts of the music scene. We had Reg Muros with Cohen Braithwaite Kilcoyne doing Stolen from God, which was phenomenal and had amazing audiences. And we had Weil and Matthews, I think 2 weekends ago. We've got a Newfoundland band next week, I think, who are coming over. They've been over for the Orkney Folk Festival. We've had Claire Sands, who's an Irish artist, who's been over. So there's a real... I think our venues can be excited by anything as long as it's really high quality, and there is an opportunity to engage. I think artists that can engage with an audience are really key.
Speaking of engagement, I think you've referred to it briefly. You have some creative engagement projects. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we have our schools programme, which is called Participate, which is a programme of work in the main with primary schools and secondary schools, so across Northumberland, County Durham and Westmorland and Furness. That was sort of set up by a colleague, also called Kate, in 2019, and she's been working really hard with a whole network of schools now and a network of regional artists. So we very much, all of the artists that we work with tend to be regional for that. Sometimes that ties into our main performances, so sometimes we have artists on our main performance schedule who also do deliver schools workshops, but often it's artists that work specifically with schools with us. Often it's workshops, so we've had a whole variety of workshops, be it music, storytelling, circus, animation, dance, and then less often we will do performances, and that's just, it depends on funding whether we can manage to do that for schools. But it's a brilliantly effective programme, and we've worked with a whole range of schools across the 3 areas. It's very well received, and I think just that those artists making huge differences with children and young people in areas where they might not be able to access arts and culture in the same way as you can in cities. So that's the creative engagement project.
And do you target any other demographic groups other than schools?
So we do offer community workshops, though we have less demand for them. So that's why originally that role was to do workshops more widely. And we used to offer workshops through, and we still do, through our venues, but actually for most of our venue promoters, promoting a performance is enough. Mm-hmm. Actually promoting a performance with a workshop or a workshop in addition is a lot bigger an ask. What we do also have, in addition to our performances, is our creative highlights workshops, which are slightly different. They're arts and crafts workshops that go into village halls in much the same way as our performances do. So therefore, they might be lino printing or felting or metal embossing, and that's something we started in spring 2021, and that's gone down fantastically well. So they tend to be for much smaller audiences, there might be between 10, 15 participants, always with a regional artist, and they tend to be half-day workshops, and just a kind of taster into whatever that arts and crafts is. But it isn't a specific, they aren't targeting a specific demographic. That's a public offer.
Mm-hmm. We talked a lot about what Highlights North does, but not about what Highlights North is. So can you give me a resume of the history of the organisation?
I can. Highlights is a rural touring scheme, and we were set up 27 years ago in Appleby, which at that point was in the Eden district, and it was set up specifically to work with venues and communities in the North Pennines. Obviously over time that has grown, and we're now working across Northumberland, County Durham and Westmorland and Furness. So we've got venues as far north as Berwick and as far on the other coast down south as Arnside and Barrow and Furness. So it's a big patch. Our office now is in Brough, so we're just outside Kirby Stephen on the A66, so quite well placed in terms of getting to the full area. And we've gone from what was a very small team to we now have a staff of 6 at the moment, and we work on our performance seasons, but we also work on national projects like the Rural Touring Dance Initiative. So there's lots of things that we're thinking about outside of the performances you see in your village halls. So in essence, we work with an army of volunteer promoters to promote, we hope, the best quality arts and culture in village halls and community spaces, schools and libraries across the north of England.
I think you mentioned you were funded by Arts Council, and there are other funders, aren't there?
Yeah, so we're an Arts Council, what they call MPO, so a National Portfolio Organisation, which means we get regular funding. So currently we have funding in place until the end of March 2027. So, from that point of view, it feels good. We also have funding from the local authorities, so from Northumberland, from County Durham and from Westmorland and Furness. We then look for additional funding from trusts and foundations, particularly for the schools and community workshops. But yes, in terms of our major funder, that would be the Arts Council.
Yeah, these are challenging times for finding funding.
They are absolutely, and I think we feel very grateful that we've got an amount of secure funding at the moment. But I think, yes, we're certainly looking at what the options are for the future. It is difficult. And, we are looking at, as I said before, that question of where the audiences are. We know that people are making different decisions with their money now. The cost of living crisis has has had an effect. So I think it is kind of thinking about, actually how we make sure that we secure the future of live performance for rural communities.
Yeah, you did briefly mention the pandemic. I'm wondering, are you aware of any lingering impact of the pandemic on small venues? Because I read in the press that small venues are really struggling and starting to go under now. Is that something you've come across? You're working with slightly different organisations, aren't you?
Yeah, I think we're working with venues that are underpinned by their own community generally. So we're just one facet of what they do, I guess. I think for me, sort of saying the pandemic is the cause for these things, I think is probably a bit of a red herring. I think it's certainly a contributing factor. But I think there's lots that has changed in terms of how people are living their lives. I think there is an element certainly, and I think we've definitely seen that, about the change of people's habits. I think that's been quite key. I think, you've certainly got people who prior to the pandemic were, they'd maybe go out and see 2 shows a month, or they might go out and go to the pub once a week for their dinner, but actually they're making different decisions because they got out of a habit. And rather than it being a fear or a pandemic response, it's just that simply what they did in their life altered, and they haven't gone back to what it was before. And then I think that has been compounded by the cost of living. I think it has been compounded by different choices that we can make. I think certainly, we've tried very hard to talk about the positives in what we do. You can go and see an amazing artist in your village hall for a ticket price of £12, maybe 15, if it's, depending on the artist. Generally, you're not paying a parking cost. You've probably driven within 5 miles. If you've driven at all, you may well have walked. A big percentage of our audiences walk to the shows. So in terms of kind of that culture on the doorstep, we offer something that is, we hope, fairly accessible to most of the audiences. But equally, it's still a commitment, and it's still time, and it's still money. And so I think people they're thinking twice about what they do. So I think, yes, there's definitely been an impact. I think it has been less than some of the the other small venues. I think from a highlights point of view, we don't have a venue. We aren't in a position where we have those overheads. Mm-hmm. As you can see, we have a very small office. And that's it. So during the pandemic, we didn't have quite the same issues that other venues did. It was the halls that dealt with that. And actually, for most of our community halls, they were beneficiaries of grants from local authorities and elsewhere, and they were able to do work that they wouldn't have been able to do had it not been for the pandemic. Their issue now, of course, is utilities and fuel costs and how to make that work.
How do you see the next 5 years evolving in your line of work?
Politically, I think a change would be well received in the industry. I think what the reality of that really is in the short term is so unknown. There isn't suddenly going to be a lot more money to be spent, but I think certainly there is hope. I think there is a big adjustment that we do need to make as an industry about what the future looks like. There's a lot of conversation, whether it's with bigger venues, smaller venues, whether it's with individual artists, about this issue about audiences and this issue about that it does feel hard. It does really feel hard to get audiences at the moment, and how we tackle that, and whether a shift in government, perhaps a national feeling of uplift might end up just having that effect. I think people feeling like they've got more money in their pocket will help if that is, if that's realistic in the next few years. I think that's one of the biggest issues. People are genuinely, across every sector of society, feeling the strain more than they were. Even the people with the most are making different decisions. I don't think anything's certain. I like to think that we're doing good things in communities who need access to the work we do, and I think, like during the pandemic, like during the cost of living crisis, we keep on keeping on, and we assess it all the time, and we have conversations about it, and we might shift our programming slightly, or look at what people are booking. But I think on the whole, we have audiences and we have promoters who want to see live work in local venues, and we want to support that while we can.
Lovely. Thank you very much. That was great. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Questions.
They're not hard. Well, they are quite hard.
They're
actually.
quite like thinky questions.
Yeah, they are thinky questions. Yes.
That was really interesting.
Thanks for listening to the 3 Times podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe and tell your friends about it.